It's a movie where Laurence Fishburne is the narrator, Captain America and Buffy the Vampire Slayer are love interests, and Captain Picard slash Charles Xavier is the villain. What could possibly go wrong? Tonight we review TMNT, an animated turtle movie that came out in the year 2007.
You came all the way down here to look for me.
Things aren't looking so good back home. Your training period ended a year ago.
Splinter sent me down here to become a better leader. I can't go back a failure.
What is your heart telling you?
I just know something's missing.
Your brothers need you, Leo. Lost without you. Leo!
I returned from my training.
Leo!
You came back.
Sorry the reunion isn't under better circumstances.
Your absence has been particularly difficult for Lafayette.
I don't even care about Leo anymore.
Well, at least his personality's still intact. This Night Watcher character's come into the neighborhood like some kind of vigilante showboat, but his days are done.
Now I know who to thank for the shot in the arm. Crime never took a break. You did.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, I distinctly remember seeing this movie actually in theaters. Fun fact, this is just the second Turtles movie that I have seen in theaters. The first one being Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. So I remember seeing this movie and being excited about it because Sarah Michelle Gellar was a voice, Charles Xavier was a voice, or Patrick Stewart was a voice. I remember being excited by the design of the Turtles and the fact that they were going to be a little bit more serious. They were kind of getting away from the Shredder, and they were going to try something different. And I remember coming out of this movie thinking it was okay, maybe even good at some points. But in rewatching this, and perhaps this is because, my palette has become so much more defined over the last few years, and as we've been reviewing these superhero movies, and I noticed some of the tropes and some of these things, I really walked away from this movie not necessarily hating it, and I want to emphasize that because we may come off a little bit more negative, at least I do not feel that this is a bad movie, but I definitely feel like this was missing something to make it good, if that makes sense.
Well, I didn't have a chance to see it in theaters, but I remember this was like my first year at Blockbuster, and of course I had like 10 free rentals a week, and we get to rent stuff ahead of time. And I remember like seeing the release date on the DVD release calendar, being so excited for this because I was like, okay, I looked at the cast and I was like, an animated Turtles movie. This sounds like it could be really good, and I was excited as you were. And then I put it on twice, and I remember falling asleep the first 15 minutes the first time. Second time I finally made it through, and I'm just like, I can't even remember anything I just watched. It was so boring. It was like watching the first Transformers animated movie, which I just truly hate that movie, and I just couldn't understand that movie. And by the end of the second viewing of this movie back in 2007 on DVD, I was just like, I don't think I ever want to watch this movie ever again. Like, I had no nostalgic feelings from it. I had no joy coming from this, and I kept thinking, like, I don't know if it was just the lighting in the room, when I watched it at the time. And I watched this the third time recently in a brightly lit room, but somehow the colors just come off so dark and muted and boring, and they can't even get the color yellow right in this movie. And I'm just thinking, like, oh, it's just so, like, poorly animated, it feels like. And it was rushed and cheap, and it just feels like they tried to animate in that, like, DreamWorks kind of style, where they kind of use the same kind of human designs as like the human designs from Shrek or whatever. That's kind of what I compare it to. But it just doesn't come off well, and there's like no detail, but there's detail in the background, but the background is poorly lit, so you can't even like enjoy the background that's really detailed. It's so like contradictory when you watch it as like an animated movie, because there's like so much emphasis on like certain things but lack of emphasis and detail on other things, and then sometimes the colors come off really well, but then most of the movie the colors come off like really bland. The only thing I liked color wise was the van.
That is quite the rant, Brian. I'm not sure. I kind of agree with you. I think the pacing of this movie is really problematic. Maybe it is your graphic design sensibilities. I didn't necessarily have a problem with the animation. In fact, I generally liked the design of the turtles. I really was not a fan of the design of Splinter, which is kind of a problem that I've noticed in Turtles 3, and will be addressed again when we talk about the latest two Turtles movies in the next couple weeks. But let's get into some of the notes here, as Brian, I know, has some strong thoughts about the technical aspects, which we'll get into. This movie was put out by Warner Brothers, which had bought out New Line Cinema, and the Weinstein Company. And, of course, when we talk about the Weinstein Company, we have to mention the problematic nature of that company and Harvey Weinstein, and just what a complete monster he was. And the fact that the Weinstein Company no longer exists is a major positive for the world of Hollywood. And as you were mentioning before, Brian, this was at a time when the Weinstein Company, they were winding down, pun not intended. At one time, they were one of the most notable studios going, and it definitely felt like in the late 2000s, early 2010s, they were definitely starting to lose it. They still were putting out some Tarantino movies, but it definitely felt like this was an example of something that was way outside of their wheelhouse, and it really didn't work.
Yeah, because at Blockbuster they had these like exclusives, like Weinstein exclusives, right? And they seem to be like these, I don't know, like 60 to 80 million dollar budget movies of like period pieces or like drama pieces that would just make no money, but they were kind of like shots in the dark to kind of get that Oscar kind of buzz. But most of those movies got none of it back in like 20 from 2008 to 20 until pretty much Weinstein closed. Like that glory year of the Oscars and all that kind of thing, that kind of went out the door. And like it shows you like that Warner Brothers reached out to the Weinstein Company, to like get the animation, because this was like a new animation company that was kind of put together, that didn't last long, that was kind of like working with or co-produced with the Weinsteins, right? And it just felt like the fact that they went to the Weinsteins of all people for animation, like they didn't go to DreamWorks, you know what I mean? Like I guess DreamWorks had the deal with Universal and before they kind of went on their own, but still, it's just so weird that they went with an independent company for something so ambitious in a Ninja Turtles animated movie. That's just kind of how I feel about it. They should have went with someone more professional, or like, I mean, god damn, it's Warner Brothers. Spend some of that money. But I guess they just, it wasn't really up to them. Maybe it was like a producing thing, because this is before that. This is before when Nickelodeon even bought Ninja Turtles, right? So I guess there was some conflict there. Probably that's why there was like this co-producing thing going on between the Weinsteins and Warner Brothers. So I just feel like if they would have just waited it out, or maybe Nickelodeon took over, and because Nickelodeon has the right idea when they're coming with the idea with the shows. Like if the shows look really good, and you know what I mean, the colors look really good, especially the 2D animated version that's out right now. That looks really good. So I just felt like they just wasted their time, kind of reaching out to the wrong people.
I really did like the animation style of the 2012 Nickelodeon series, even though it was definitely designed for television in a lot of ways. I think it was so much better than what we saw here. I will say that what makes this movie so different and so unique is that this was meant to be a loose continuation of the original trilogy. It ignored the television series Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation, which, Brian, I don't know if you remember that TV series, but it should best be known as the crossover that they did with the Power Rangers.
Yeah, and I remember the fifth Ninja Turtle. She was female. I forget the name, but that was pretty ambitious at the time in that whole, Fox Kids era in the mid '90s. Big bad Beetleborgs, that kind of thing. You know what I mean? That live action kaiju fighting. It just fit right in. You know what I mean? But because of the low budget, I remember clearly how bad the suits were. I don't know about you, but I remember the suits being pretty bad in the show.
I was not watching at this time, but I do remember being very much excited for this because it was a continuation. Even if I was not necessarily a fan of the third one, we see a number of items toward the end of the movie that referenced the live-action movies, that being the helmet and staff of the Shredder, a foot ninja mask, the canister of ooze that mutated the turtles, and Splinter, the Time Scepter, Walker's hat, Lord Noreaga's helmet, and pieces of the suit of armor worn by the Turtles in the 1993 film. So this is very much a loose continuation of that. Some of the other notable parts of this movie, first is Karai. In her original incarnation, she was completely unrelated to the Shredder and is actually a member of the Foot Clan's Council of Five, higher rank than the Shredder in the Foot Clan's global hierarchy. It is presumed Karai has the same status in this movie, as she is not referred to as the adopted daughter of Shredder, as she was in the 2003 and the 2012 animated series. So I know that you were a little bit confused about that. But just to be clear, she is not presumed to be the daughter in the continuity of this movie.
Yeah, I wasn't even quite familiar with the character, and like even on the third watch of this movie, I just completely forgot about that. And then I had to research like, is she supposed to be the stepdaughter, the daughter of Shredder, or whatever? But it just sucks that like they gave her like these lines of dialogue and it really amounted to nothing because she was like a nothing character because they gave us no background about her. I don't know if they just expected the fans to know who she was or whatever, but as like a casual like me who doesn't necessarily go into the comics, is more familiar with the old school cartoon, it really didn't strike home with me that like, oh, this is like a really important character, and they didn't really treat her as one anyway.
There were originally some sequel ideas that were being thrown about, the first of which was an adaptation of the comic book saga City at War. Michelangelo feels like the odd man out, and against his brother's wishes, he joins the Foot Clan, and he dons a black bandana. Meanwhile, the Turtles travel to Japan, cross paths Karai in an adventure that would result in the returning of their arch nemesis, the Shredder, and TMNT would have brought in the Technodrome and Dimension X, and I don't know how I feel about this, but I almost wish we had gotten a version of at least TMNT 2, because we once again have a movie where Leonardo and Raphael are in conflict, and Donatello and Michelangelo are very much shoved to the background, and I think that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I'm just more for the Technodrome and Krang because at least that would have been fresh. You know what I mean? At this point, we've seen the Shredder so much in the movies and like reference to him a lot, but in the show, like it just feels like the Technodrome and Krang and all that, like in Bebop and Rocksteady, they're so iconic, but they get so left out in the movies. I thought this would have been a perfect opportunity to do that. Reading these plot lines, I would have much rather had the plot from the third proposed movie as for this movie, because I think at least that would have been something more interesting. Because I mean, deep down, like really, the plot of this movie is just a Scooby Doo plot. It's really just the 13 Ghosts of Scooby Doo, which is ridiculous because I mean, that's a Scooby Doo plot for a Ninja Turtle movie. Like that, come on, that's not that creative.
The plot of this movie is definitely problematic, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes. As revealed in the director's commentary on the DVD, one of the early drafts of the script had Raphael briefly dying and Donatello using Winter's technology to bring him back to life. This idea was turned down by Peter Laird, who disliked the idea of having one of the turtles dying. I completely agree with this. My attitude is, unless you're actually going to go and follow through with it, there is no point to killing someone when we know they're going to come back to life. This is a trope of movies that needs to go away and die forever.
Yeah, there needs to be consequences, and something like that would have been felt so cheap. And yeah, Raph would have been the perfect guy to do that because that's totally his personality. But even in this, I just felt like he went more out there to be that kind of Wolverine Lone Ranger kind of type, and it just doesn't work for me. I mean, it works in a certain respect, like in the first original movie, but here, just like it was just over the top and too much, I thought. And then if he would have died at the end, it would just been too much. You know what I mean? And it would have made me dislike Raphael even more because I really dislike him in this movie, which sucks.
Kevin Smith is actually the voice of the diner chef. I don't know if you realize that, Brian, but we've mentioned Kevin Smith throughout the history of this podcast and in a number of notable ways, and this is just one more case of him being involved. And we're gonna have one more instance where we talk about Kevin Smith.
Yeah, and again, that Weinstein connection, that's kind of where I picked up on that as well. They probably asked them to do it. They're probably like, hey, Kevin Smith is the comic book guy. Let's call Kevin in. He'll probably do this voice for us or something, just to get a name on the marquee. You know what I mean? That's why I kind of felt like they picked Zhang Ziyi, just to get that name on the marquee.
And boy, did they ever not do anything with her, right?
Oh man, Godzilla did 10 times more with her.
Which is amazing because Godzilla really still didn't do anything with her either, if you think about it.
Well, at least they doubled up and cast her twice as the twins. That's kind of a spoiler alert, but please check out Godzilla. I know Jerome didn't like it as much as me.
The amazing thing is that you would never realize that there were twins in that movie. They never make it clear. It's absurd.
Well, it was the hair, obviously, but that's we'll talk about in another future possible podcast about Godzilla. But that was clearly for the fans because we all know they're twins, man. It's Mothra.
Oh boy. Alright, let's get back on track here. Let's get to the heroes. I actually like the concept and the conceit of this movie. The idea is that the turtles are lost and separated. Donnie is an IT person. Mikey is working children's parties. Raphael is a vigilante. I kind of wanted to see a dark and gritty Logan-style movie starring Raph after watching this, and I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get it, but I think it would be an interesting concept, probably better explored in a comic book series. Leonardo is finding himself in an unnamed Central American country, because of course he is, because that's what people do. Splinter really doesn't serve much of a purpose, and it's disappointing because the voice actor that they cast is kind of a legend in the industry, and he passed away, unfortunately, before this movie came out. I don't know what to think about the Turtles. Again, Michelangelo and Donatello are very much put to the background. I really do appreciate the setup, but Raphael comes across as being the most unlikable person. And whenever you're dealing with Raphael, it is a real fine line between is he being an anti-hero or is he just being a dick? And in this movie, it very much felt like he was just kind of being a dick at certain points, and Leonardo was kind of being a dick too, especially when they had their big battle, and Raphael actually kicked Leonardo's ass, which is something that is worth discussing, but it very much feels like this movie is so serious and does not have any sense of humor about itself. And there was just something about the way that they executed the first movie that it was not complicated adult humor, but something about it felt more genuine than this movie, which the comedy in this movie was just atrocious when it was there.
Yeah, it's that whole dynamic between the two again. Like they're playing up on that original first movie kind of, feud that they had, Leonardo and Raphael, and I never really picked up on the feud until I guess in this movie, but I guess it was more, in the background or more prominent than I, realized, I guess. But it's just weird because I don't know. I never see Raphael as this asshole up until now. Like this is really the first time where he comes off as like a truly asshole kind of character, and like at one point when they're fighting, I just feel like, why are you fighting them? Like, there's no point in fighting your brothers, and you're trying to get to the same goal, and it's just kind of a waste of time. And then he, even like 10 minutes later, he admits I did something really stupid. And it's just like, yeah, dude, like, come on. Why are you making these stupid decisions? You're smarter than that. I feel like some of these characters are smarter than the way they act in this movie. And I know Leonardo should not be acting so cocky as he is, because he even goes out and says, like, I'm better than you. Total Ric Flair kind of move, or like, you know what I mean? Like, man, just like a main event kind of player kind of move, and just kind of like treating Raph as like this upper mid Carter. I know I'm using wrestling terminology, but that's kind of the way it felt. And then all of a sudden, like, they're pretty much equal at the end, and it's pretty much like yeah, Leonardo is the leader, but pretty much like the strongest might be Raph, actually. It's kind of the case of like Cyclops and Wolverine, kind of similar to that, in that, we know Wolverine is definitely the stronger X-Men, but Cyclops will always be the leader kind of thing. And that's just the way the dynamic goes. And they kind of went nowhere with it at the end, because it just felt like, well, is Raph the leader now? He kind of proved himself. But did they just have a random fight out of nowhere to prove what? That, the whole point of them fighting was that Leonardo didn't even realize that, that he was the vigilante in the mask, and then he takes it off and he's like, oh, it's Raph? And it's just like,
Which makes no sense, because my understanding in the early part of this movie is that Donatello and Michelangelo very clearly seem to understand that Raphael is this vigilante, but Leonardo doesn't. I never understood how that worked out, especially because where is Raphael storing this vigilante suit? Right? He's got to be storing it in the sewer, right?
Exactly, and where's the bike? And he's hiding this bike, and there's all these kind of questions, and it's like, I don't know, like, what's the whole point of it all? Like, does he continue on in the suit at the end? Why is he doing this whole vigilante thing? Why aren't they just going out in the team of three, right? It doesn't make any sense. I feel like there was this whole other, I don't know, movie that was missing in between, and we're just kind of thrown in, and this is like the sequel to a movie that we never got. And it's kind of like that. I don't know. It feels like a Halloween offshoot sequel. Like this is kind of like an H2O Halloween Resurrection. You know what I mean? Where it's kind of like they're following on previous installments, like the original trilogy, and kind of making their own. But it just doesn't work out. So that's kind of how it is when they're trying to do these offshoot sequels.
All right, so we still have to talk about April and Casey. April is the person trying to bring them back together, and now she can do jujitsu. She's no longer a journalist and is apparently 10 to 15 years younger. Casey, also 10 to 15 years younger. There's some love struggles that go on between them. I understand why you would cast Sarah Michelle Gellar and Chris Evans in these roles, but part of the problem when you cast famous people is if the performances aren't there, then the characters are going to come off really poorly. I don't think Chris Evans in this movie is particularly good. I don't think Sarah Michelle Gellar is particularly good. It is more of a curiosity that these two people are in this movie together at kind of a crossroads in their career, because Sarah Michelle Gellar is definitely coming down from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Chris Evans is very much kind of on the way up as he would get Captain America 4 years later. So from that, it is kind of a historical curiosity. And I don't know whether this is kind of a result of Corey Feldman and the way that his voice and the way it connects with Donnie. I don't like Donatello's voice casting. I think it's easily the worst. I generally think the Turtles' voice casting is at least close to the original trilogy, and I think that aspect of it works, but for whatever reason, I don't think Donatello's works.
Quick shout out to Nolan North. He was the voice of Raphael. He's kind of like this video game voice legend. A bunch of PlayStation, Sony games, Naughty Dog. He's the voice of Nathan Drake in the Uncharted series, and I love that Uncharted series. It's one of the few video games I actually play on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 3. So, credit to him because this is actually like a big movie production that he got a paycheck for. But yeah, like it's just so weird that Chris Evans sucks so bad in this movie, and so does Sarah Michelle Gellar, and so does Mako, who's a legend in the business, who's the voice of Splinter, and he was an Oscar nominee in the '70s. He was like, this was one of his last roles. This was like his last animated movie. He died in 2006. This came out in 2007, and yet he still sounds like awful. And I don't know what it is, and I figured it out. I think it's just like the director does not know how to direct voice acting. You know what I mean? Like it's just like they're reading these lines, they're not being directed, so they're just kind of reading it flat, and then they're using these flat cuts for the movie, and that's why Chris Evans sounds so flat, and Sarah Michelle Gellar sounds so flat. Even though we know they're capable of so much more, they're just not being directed well, and that really reflects on the performances, obviously. And overall, my score is a 5, just because I feel like the voice acting was so off, and I feel like the only people really trying and actually getting some direction for the character were the turtles, but all the human characters were just kind of flat.
I really appreciated some of the voice work. I really, again, liked the setup and wish we had gotten a little bit more. I guess I'm going to be a little bit more generous and give this a 6 for those reasons. I was at least intrigued by some of the interactions between Casey and Raphael and kind of keeping that relationship. I do feel that Casey, the way that his characterization was, it at least felt a little bit closer to the way that he was in the first one as opposed to the third one where he served no purpose. So I feel a little bit better about this than you do, but certainly I can't really argue against what you're saying. The villains, Winters is sort of a villain. His motivations are not really that interesting for the most part of the movie. Karai is tangentially related to this, and it's very obvious that she was being set up for a more important role in a future movie, but they clearly wanted to introduce her in this movie. So what ends up happening is the villains are literally just giant beasts, giant rock creatures, and that's it.
Yeah, that's it, right? And it's just like I mentioned before, these 13 ghosts of Scooby Doo that come out of a portal, and you know what I mean? At least Shazam did it way better, right? At the end, when all the monsters or whatever came out, or those creatures were trying to come out, it's kind of the same concept. and it's just kind of whatever. And then Patrick Stewart doesn't even sound like a villain. You know what I mean? Like at least sound, you know, sly and cunning and evil. But I guess he was just sounding normal, and they just said, "Oh, okay, we'll take it as a cut, and just we'll use it no matter what. It's an animated movie, no one cares." So it felt like the performance even from Patrick Stewart was lacking. It just felt like he was reading lines, and the whole idea is that this guy's immortal, this warrior. He was exposed to this, portal radiation or something that made him immortal, and it was like a ceremony from 3,000 years ago. So he wants to go back to being mortal again because of reasons unknown. Obviously, I mean, I guess the assumption is you're living that long, you go crazy. But this is a kids movie, so obviously you have to explain to these kids why this guy wants to be not immortal anymore, but they didn't. So they kind of threw that under the bus. I don't know, just poorly put together. And the fact that he wasn't even really a bad guy at the end. So in reality, really the bad guys were like his soldiers and his generals that were made out of stone. It's so bad. It's terrible. I want to give this a 2.
I am giving this a 3, if for no other reason than I appreciated that they did introduce Karai, and that's really about it. I think that she is a potentially interesting character that was terribly underdeveloped, and I did appreciate that the Beast served somewhat of a purpose, and there was an interesting payoff at least toward the end. I don't know. I think a plot like this that has been done to death so much, and one of the things I want to talk about, Brian, before we go to the story, is we talked about tropes of superhero movies. We have another trope that I want to identify, and that is towers. Batman Begins, The Avengers, this movie, the movie we're going to talk about next week. Climaxes all take place on top of towers on rooftops. Definitely something that's worth noting.
You know what? I want to say it's because of Ghostbusters, man. That's the earliest I can kind of take it back to. If you want to include Superman 3, I guess, but that didn't really end on top of that rich dude's tower, right? It was like off in the desert. So I want to say it's Ghostbusters, man. You got the beam of light in the sky. You got the weird portal opening up. It's at the top of the building. I think it all comes from that, man.
You may very well be right. I mean, it definitely happens in the Suicide Squad as well. So I could probably go on for hours on this, but we're just gonna go on to talk about the story. I love the idea that the movie mentions real estate plummeting, and then this came out in 2007, and what happened in 2008? Real estate prices, they plummeted like crazy. So I guess the Turtles movie gets a little bit of credit for predicting the house crash.
Yeah, unfortunately, but who knew, right? March 2007. Also, a little small note, this is the same month as 300. So, there you go.
Fascinating how that works. The Turtles come together and they defeat a bunch of beasts. I would say the action is really underwhelming and not even as entertaining as the first two movies. And you would think the action would be that would be better and better executed because it's animated, but that was definitely not the case. The big reveal is pretty uninteresting because Winters himself is very uninteresting. It's amazing to me that this movie is an hour and 26 minutes, and it simultaneously feels like there's a lot going on, and yet nothing is going on at the same time. And I think this is very often what happens with movies that try to jam in too much and too much going on. I really do appreciate the premise, but I think this needed a lot more time to really get across the melancholy of what's happening with the Turtles, because essentially by the 30-minute mark, they're back together, and if you're going to separate them like this, then you really have to spend time developing it. I mean, if you think back to the Avengers movies, think about how the Captain America and Iron Man were basically separated for an entire movie, and a significant amount of time before they were actually united again in Avengers Endgame. So, for all those reasons, I'm giving the story a 5 because of an interesting premise that ultimately is not followed up on.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the issues lie for me, too. Um, and then one big issue for me is like the lack of background on Karai. Like, I felt like so lost that she was just thrown in there, and we get no background on her, and no, she's just there. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing Zhang Ziyi as the voice, and I'm just like, God, that's a lot of money for a random voice. Because she's a big time player, especially in China and all these international places for box office numbers and stuff like that. And she's kind of a big star, and you're wasting all this money on, was it 6 lines of dialogue? So I don't know, man. I felt that was a total waste of time. And then the fact that the villain of your movie is not really the villain, and it's really just the stone statues, and the ending is just kind of like not necessarily far-fetched, just kind of like bland and ridiculous. You know what I mean? And the fact that they wasted Michelangelo in this movie, I felt, who's like could have been a major factor in this movie, and could have relied on his comedy a little bit more, and they just kind of wasted it on maybe like one or two jokes on sneezing at the end of the movie, which is kind of stupid. And the fact that Splinter was poorly written in this movie, or underdeveloped maybe to an extent. I don't know. There's just so many things lacking in the script in this movie. So for me, like based on all that, I'm giving this a 4, and it's disappointing because like they're trying to do so much, like you said, but I mean, there's just lack of details and lack of cause and lack of reason. Things just happen. And, like we should have got maybe like 10 more minutes of like maybe a background story as to why even Leonardo left. Like, let's see the reason why Leonardo left in the first place. There had to have been some kind of event that triggered that, right? Let's see the trigger.
Absolutely. When we think about the technical aspects, I know this is something that you kind of talked about earlier. I think the music is pretty decent. I think the animation generally looks very solid. Of course, this movie being 12 years old, it's not going to look nearly as good. I think the pacing of this movie is a real problem, especially toward the end when the third act just kind of happens and the final battle is very brisk. And again, there really isn't a lot of action to this movie, and when there is, it doesn't look all that great. And for all those reasons, I'm giving the technical aspects, because this is kind of a mixed bag. I'm giving this a 5 as well.
I'm gonna give it a 4, man, and it's so awful the way that I think they kind of put this together. Just like I said, the colors are bad. I felt like they were going for that Shrek DreamWorks style, and it just missed the mark completely. Like Shrek came out in 2001, and I know that had a bigger budget, but maybe just the fact that this was like a $30 million budget, animated, you're kind of limited on what you can render and how many things you can render at a time. I mean, look at Incredibles in 2004. That looks way better than this. You know what I mean? And even smaller movies animated movies that have come out in that little 3 year period, I thought, look better than this too. So even something like the Jimmy Neutron movie, for Christ's sake, looked better, or even the SpongeBob movie or whatever. Just so many movies that came out in this little time span that look way better than this, and it just felt like cheap and dated. So, and I didn't even like the music at all, unrecognizable. At least give me some of the notes from the original theme, and they didn't even do that. They tried to be original and modern and dark, and it just didn't work.
Which is bizarre to me, because if you're going to do this as a continuation, then either do it as a continuation or don't. Like, they're kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too, and it doesn't really work out so well. The legacy of this movie, it's almost been completely forgotten by everyone. It did not do that well at the box office, and because of that, it killed hope of a trilogy. The one thing I will say is that I think they adapted this animation style for the 2012 show, which I think is significantly better than this movie. Karai gets to be significantly more developed. They do a lot more with April and Casey. If you look at the characters and designs for this movie and compare it to the TV show, I think you will find a lot of those same elements. And maybe this is blasphemous, Brian. I think the 2012 through 16 version of the Turtles is actually better than the original 1980s, early 90s kid show. Is that too blasphemous to say?
In terms of animation, I can see that, because I mean, I've seen episodes of that 2012 show, and I have mixed feelings on the Michelangelo interpretation or whatever, because it's Beast Boy and whatever. But I mean, I do like the animation style a lot better in the show, that's for sure. But then again, it's like 80s animation kind of has its charm, you know what I mean? But it's just 2D versus 3D in certain aspects. But I get what you're saying, and I could agree with that, But it's amazing how they got the show so much better animated than this movie that was only like 4 or 5 years earlier.
Right, and for all those reasons, the legacy score, I'm giving this a 4.
I'm going with it too. I mean, I was looking at the box office numbers. You could, in theory, call it a moderate success because the budget was 32, gross 95 domestically, but then really, like, there was no international, there was no word of mouth. I don't even think DVD sales were that even great. So yeah, it's kind of flat, and no one remembers it. And it's kind of one of those dark secrets that the Warner Brothers really kind of hide from you. And then, I mean, the Nickelodeon version doesn't even hardly reference this at all. So there you go.
That about says it all, I guess. All right, my total score is a 23.
Mine's a 17, much lower than yours. Usually it's kind of the same. Sometimes mine is a little higher, but in this case, way lower just because I guess I had a worse experience. And the fact that, like, I almost fell asleep again watching this movie says a lot.
The total score is a 40, which means that this is well above the pile of shame level. I certainly do not think this is pile of shame worthy. I think it's more boring than bad in a lot of cases, and Brian may disagree with me on this point, but I think that this movie was ultimately very fixable in a lot of ways, and we can get maybe to that in the burning questions. Question the first, Brian. This is the one you're probably most anticipating. Should they have introduced Krang in this movie?
He should have just been the villain because it's so recognizable and it's iconic, and they hadn't done it in a movie yet. And if you're gonna do an animated movie, it's perfect. Just do that because that, you can do the toys and bring it back and do all those kind of things and make it nostalgic. But instead, they went this different route. And as much as like I'm not necessarily a fan of Krang as a character himself because I just feel like he's just one of those kind of villains that the Turtles can overpower. You know what I mean? It's always been Shredder as like the number one heel, but it would have been something different and unique, I think.
I agree. I think this is the movie to introduce Krang. It works so much better in animated form than in television, or I should say in live action form. I just think he's a really hard character to render, even if you do the Jim Henson style. I just think that's really, really difficult. This is the perfect form to do that. Instead of bringing in Winters, who nobody cares about, why not bring in Krang instead? And again, this is something the show does a lot better. Would this movie have been better branched out as a season of television?
I'll say yes, but barely because I can't picture this as like a 22 episode season one kind of arc. Maybe 12 at most. And I know at times, like around like 2007, 2008, we got like a short run X-Men Wolverine series that was kind of limited. That was under 20 episodes, I think. It's just really, with a season like this, like on TV, you got to stretch it out. So I think it would have been stretched out too much. If they would have just gave me an hour and 50-minute, well written, well thought out movie with background and detail, I think that would have been slightly better. But if you're going to do it as a show, 12 episodes.
Right, and with Disney Plus, we're going to have all of the animated TV shows to watch just from Marvel alone, which we will see if we get into that. What did Laurence Fishburne purchase with his paycheck from this movie?
Since it was 2007, I want to say an HD player, and then about a year later regrets it because he was like, "Oh shit, I should have went with Blu-ray," and then got stuck with a bunch of HD movies that have no value now.
I would like to think that he bought a nice trinket, perhaps jewelry, perhaps a nice vacation for his wife, Gina Torres. That is what I like to think, that he did something very nice for her because she deserves it. And let's face it, that's probably the only good thing that came out of this movie. I love the fact that he was being hyped as the narrator, and he literally narrates the beginning of the movie, and then he pieces out.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's that, hey, let's get this guy on the marquee and just pay him, and then it'll be like, oh, we got Laurence Fishburne in a Ninja Turtles movie. People will love to see that because he was in The Matrix.
If I interview Patrick Stewart tomorrow, does he remember his involvement with this movie? I say no.
I'll say no as well because they'll probably just confuse it with a random American Dad episode.
Do the Turtles just work better on television?
You know what? I still think it works in a movie, man, because despite them being foreign, you got to do background, kind of character work on them. That first movie shows it could still work. You just got to give it time. And even in a 90-minute movie, you can give it time. You just got to do it right. So I haven't lost hope. You know what I mean? I know we still got two movies coming up in the next 2 weeks, but, I saw that 2014 movie in the theater, and I was just like, oh, God. God, God, God. They got it wrong again. But I'm still hopeful. You never know. I mean, we just saw a Dark Crystal comeback series that has kind of like blown everyone's expectations out of the water. So you never know. Nickelodeon could reach out and do something crazy like that, but that's just me.
You just said Dark Crystal did a series. Let's emphasize that also was a television series and not a movie.
Yes, it's a prequel series on Netflix right now, and everyone loves it. And if you do that with the Turtles, man, I would cry.
Honestly, I mean that's kind of what I was getting at, and that when we talk in 2 weeks, we'll probably talk more about it. I mean, at this point, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the Turtles do work just better on television, because at this point, I would say we are a solid, like, 1.5. If I give Turtles 2, like, a half point, we're 1.5 out of 4, and spoiler alert, we're probably going to be like 1.5 out of 6 by the end of this, because, Brian, next week, we are reviewing a movie that almost, and probably did break me, and that would be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2014 version, produced by...
Good old Michael Bay. Good old Michael Bay.
We are going to talk about that movie next week, and again, it's a movie that almost broke me. Thing is, it's produced by Michael Bay, it's not directed by Michael Bay, so what you get is, you get a director doing an impersonation of Michael Bay. Michael Bay, at least, is an interesting filmmaker in the way he does his visuals. Just imagine a low-rent Michael Bay, and you know what you're going to get yourself into next week, as we talk about the 7-foot-tall, steroided-out Turtles.
Yeah, and it's CGI that looks so fake that it's just... God, man. I'm so not looking forward to that.
So next week, we're going to talk about whitewashing, yellowwashing, and farts. We thank you so much for listening this week. We will talk to you again next week.
Oh, hey, Will Arnett! I'm totally down now.